You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, my name is Osman Butt and you're watching MEMO Conversations. Today I'm joined by Christiana Parreira, and she is an assistant professor in the Department of International Relations and Political Science at the Graduate Institute. Her research focuses on the role of local political institutions and actors in governance, looking primarily at post-conflict contexts in the Middle East and North Africa. Her forthcoming book project examines how local governments and election facilitates predatory state-building practices in Lebanon. In other research, she examines determinants of governance quality and distributive outcomes in Lebanon, Iraq, and elsewhere in the global South. She received her PhD from Stanford University in 2020 before joining the Graduate Institute. She serves as a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University and a postdoctoral associate at Harvard Kennedy's Middle East Initiative. Christina, welcome to Middle East Conversations Live.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
In October 2019, there was an uprising in Lebanon, which initially started because there was a WhatsApp tax that was imposed on the population or was going to be imposed. This angered a lot of people and it started street demonstrations. And this was sort of the run up to this tax. There had just been a major wildfire across Lebanon where large parts of the country had burnt down. But the protests, as they came onto the street, sort of snowballed and turned into something much, much bigger, turned into a protest against the wider political establishment in Lebanon. So in October, so to ask you, Christina, we saw widespread anti-government demonstrations, especially outside Beirut. But could you perhaps tell us who was protesting and what compelled them to come onto the streets?
Sure. So I think it's important to note, first of all, that the protests that started in October of 2019 were the first protests that were sort of universal across all regions of the country and across all different sort of ethno-religious or sectarian groups in Lebanon. So, for example, protests in 2005, what later became known as the Cedar Revolution, were largely concentrated among Sunni Muslims and Christians. They also largely occurred within Beirut. And likewise, the U-Stink protests around the garbage crisis in 2015 were largely concentrated within the capital, and they were not sustained for very long. These demonstrations, I would say by contrast, were very sustained and widely attended, even in sort of peripheral urban areas like Tripoli and Saida. So in terms of who participated, I was actually conducting a survey in Saida when the protests began. So we did pause the survey for security and safety reasons and then returned to it a few weeks later. And we added some questions asking people about protest participation. And actually quite a few of our respondents had participated in the protests in that first month. And so we got a sense demographically of what that subset looked like. And similar to what we know about a lot of protests that have happened in the Middle East and the global South over the last 10, 20 years, protesters were generally younger, better educated. There was a slight male skew and had higher levels of unemployment. So kind of tracking with what we've seen in other protest contexts, particularly in the Arab world. In terms of the causes of the protests, you mentioned the WhatsApp tax. You mentioned the wildfires, and I think it's important to separate between sort of proximate causes and structural causes. And I think those were both really, really important sort of sparks that lit the initial protest. But I think the structural causes were much more dire, of course, and they were also related, right? Because these are all sort of, governance failures and seemingly, in the case of the WhatsApp tax, sort of actions taken by what were perceived as a predatory political elite. I would say over the longer run, since the end of the civil war in Lebanon in 1990, by most measures of quality of infrastructure, social protection, and social welfare provision, Lebanon is one of the most poorly governed countries in the world. and certainly among what were, at the time in 2019, its upper middle income peers. And because of this, most services have been effectively, at least partially, privatized. And this, of course, comes at great cost to citizens, and in particular to lower and middle class citizens who obviously went out into the streets and protested.
Yeah, Lebanon's quite an interesting place because it's one of these places where you've got such poor governance and poor outcomes, but it's, for a long time, obviously many years ago, it was famed for its financial institutions, and it was even praised because it was one of the few countries that didn't suffer massively from the 2008 crash because of so-called conservative banking in Lebanon, and it led to some charge of some people claiming in most countries have a bank. In Lebanon, the bank has a country. So it's a very interesting dynamic there. And I want to sort of think about this as we're moving on to the next sort of question, which is that we often, Lebanon is known for having 18 or so religious sects, and it's very well known it's a sectarianized political system. You've got a Christian president, a Sunni prime minister, and a Shia Speaker of the House. So it's very structurally sectarian with different political parties playing for that role. But I'm wondering, what does this sectarian narrative miss about politics in Lebanon?
Yeah, I really like this question because I don't want, first of all, to discount the role of what are referred to as confessional politics or ethnic consociationalism in Lebanon. This is certainly extremely important to understanding how power is distributed, how people understand the concept of representation. But this is, I think, just one axis among many along which political identity is exercised and contested. So what I found in my research, for example, is that power is negotiated in Lebanon not only between, let's say, Sunni Muslim and Shia Muslim, but also between central and peripheral elites. And this is the story of state building and in particularly post-conflict state building almost everywhere, and certainly in the post-Ottoman sphere. So I think the central dilemma that elites of all different ethno-sectarian groups or factions or whatever you want to call them in Lebanon face is, how do states and state elites at the center incorporate sources of local power and local elites in a way that ties them into the state building process at minimal cost? And this process also involves a great deal of contestation and conflict. So, for example, going back to the protests, the story, I think, of a city like Tripoli protesting, Tripoli became known as the sort of bride of the revolution within the first few months of the protests in 2019. And the story of Tripoli protesting, I think, was not in any way about sectarian grievances or Sunni Muslim grievances. This isn't the way it was framed by protest leaders. It's not the way that it was framed by people on the ground. It was, and when I went to protest events in Tripoli in the first few months of the protests, I heard this over and over again, fundamentally about grievances related to residents of the city having been neglected by the state and relegated to the margins of the project of the Lebanese state, and about even Tripolitan elites within the central state having sort of failed in their mission to represent the citizens. So again, it's a center-periphery story and not a sectarian one.
Yes, and this sort of leads into our next question, which is because when we sort of look at Lebanon, we have a lot of unofficial or semi-official bodies that do a lot of the governance. You've got what could be termed as charities, but also sort of civil society organizations, but that are semi-affiliated to certain political parties who hold certain ministries and districts. And there's always this question about when you've got one party holding one part of the ministry, them using the resources for their communities, who they're going to vote for them. With so many different, bodies and interests and institutions in Lebanon, I suppose the question I have is, who's actually running the country?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to effectively answer that question for you, but I'll do my best to not answer it in typical academic style. So I actually think one of the most compelling aspects of power in Lebanon, and many scholars have written about this previously, is how diffuse it is. And this is often one of the reasons why Lebanon is characterized as a weak state, or at this point and in various points in its history, a failed state. And what I would say is the channels by which the state and its attendant elites, in fact, exercise power are often via a variety of what you've highlighted and pointed out as sort of non-state actors, right? Parties, charitable organizations set up by political entrepreneurs, ethno-religious institutions, even armed groups. And like I said, these are often enumerated as reasons why the Lebanese state is weak, because they're put in comparison to the sort of like hollow shell of the state outside of its relationship to those institutions. But in fact, many of those institutions are tied into the state. Many of them are engaging in partnerships with the state. So for example, the primary healthcare system in Lebanon is largely administered by the Ministry of Health, but frequently these physical institutions across the country are funded and administered on a daily basis by non-state organizations, including non-state organizations and charities tied to political figures who exercise power within the state. So it's all very confusing and windy, but it's just to say that I think the state diffuses power in Lebanon in a way, that's difficult to pinpoint, but conversely, it's difficult to target and break down. And I think in a way that has been one of the central dilemmas of protest organizers and people who have sought to put forward a sort of reformist politics in the aftermath of the protests.
So from what you're saying, because obviously power is diffused, and when protest leaders are sort of thinking about how to build a new state, are they trying to think about a new state in terms of how they think a state should look like based on examples from outside of Lebanon, or are they thinking of a new way of reformulating that diffused politics?
It's a good question, and I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of protesters, in part because I don't think that there are a uniform set of demands. I think on one end of the spectrum, you do see people calling for a fundamental rupture in or abolition of confessional politics. And of course, looking outside of Lebanon, people point to cases like Iraq as examples of the other ways in which ethno-sectarian confessionalism typically has not worked. And I think that would constitute a very radical departure from how politics has happened in Lebanon since 1943 and since well prior. On the other hand, you have people who are proposing more modest reforms. But again, I think it's really difficult to sort of know where to best pull at this Gordian knot of the Lebanese political system in a way that would produce reform. And again, many of the ways in which the state is weak and perhaps deserves to be strengthened are in fact engineered. These aren't flaws. These aren't design flaws. They're in fact they're features of the system, not bugs, I think is how the expression goes.
So what is the origin of this feature? Why did it turn out this way, that you'd have such a diffused basis for power?
I'm not a historian, and I couldn't speak precisely to, I think it's difficult to pinpoint the origins of why the Lebanese state had the peculiar form that it does. I think obviously there are people who highlight the role of colonialism and how French colonial authorities engineered a particular system of proto-sectarian power sharing in a way that would render the state purposely weak. Of course, there's the argument that Lebanon has historically served as a sort of quote unquote laissez-faire banking center within the Middle East. And so keeping it a sort of like comparatively weak state, not having particularly robust social protection, social welfare institutions is in fact sort of inherent to the role that it was designed to serve within the region. I think there's a lot of different arguments that you can make. And I think all of them probably have, validity. It's not the story of one or the other. But I also think moving forward, it's important to understand, to not sort of point to origins maybe decades or centuries ago, and then to sort of draw a clear straight line to the present. And I certainly think, and in my own research, encountered that the Civil War and interventions that were made in governance in the aftermath of the Civil War, particularly interventions that were made by the parties that have taken power since the end of the Civil War were particularly impactful in terms of producing this sort of dysfunctional governance system.
I want to now zoom away a little bit from talking about the institutions themselves, and I want to think more about the politics, right? But I specifically, because to my mind, obviously, as you find in many countries, certain places and cities tend to dominate the discussion. So when we talk about Lebanon, it's interchangeable with Beirut. But I'm wondering, what does politics even look like if you're living in Tripoli or even in villages in the Bekaa Valley?
Yeah, I think this is a really great point. Typically, the politics of the capital in a place like Lebanon, or really no matter where you look, are going to be very, very different from the politics of the urban periphery and then from the politics of more sort of like peri-urban or rural areas. And it's no different in Lebanon. So first of all, from a technical administrative perspective, the Beirut municipality is administered in a completely different way than any other city in the country, even Tripoli. So it's administered much more heavily by the central state than by the municipal officials that constitute the municipal government itself. So I would separate that out from a sort of institutional perspective. Secondly, I would say, yes, there is a series of more specific ways in which power is exercised at the municipal level, again, distinguishing between urban and rural municipalities outside of Beirut. In these areas, generally, the local government and local elites are the front lines of service provision. And this is tied to the central state in various ways that I've done a lot of research on, but also very separate. These officials don't have a ton of independence or autonomy, but they do have a lot of responsibilities for everyday governance. That being said, particularly in smaller peri-urban and rural municipalities, local governments and elites, or at least formal sort of elected officials, have very little sort of independent capacity. So for example, I believe the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies did a study showing the vast majority of municipalities have fewer than 5 employees. Many of them have not a single employee. Many have incredibly small budgets. And this renders most of them either ineffective as service providers, as they're sort of designated by the central state, or heavily dependent on the central state. I think another related sort of axis of variation at the local level, particularly outside of Beirut, is the degree of party control over municipalities. So these parties that have come to dominate Lebanese politics since the end of the Civil War also exercise a lot of power at the local level as well. In many municipalities, you see a near monopoly over power, specifically in large part by active party members within the municipality. In other places, party members may co-opt or partner with local notables or prominent families. And in other places, far less frequently, as of today, you see a sort of independent opposition to governing parties that has come to exist. But this is all to say that I think there's a huge diversity in how politics looks at the local level, often very, very distinct from what politics in a place like Beirut looks like.
When you were doing your ground research, especially outside Beirut, which areas did you go to, and the places you went to, what were people saying to you about what their concerns are?
Yeah, so as a bit of background, I did most of my doctoral research in a set of 4 cities, and most of my research was conducted between 2017 and just before the start of the protests in 2019. I first looked at the cases of Tripoli and Saida, and second, as a sort of secondary comparative case study, at the cases of Baalbek and Sur. And what I was trying to understand was, rather than looking at a sort of like sect level comparison between cities, I was trying to understand how the degree of political party control over municipal governments affects what service provision looks like, what everyday governance looks like. I compared Tripoli and Saida because they have similar demographic compositions, but different legacies of party control vis-a-vis the now defunct Future Movement, the main Sunni political party. And likewise, Baalbek and Sur have different legacies pertaining to the control of the Hezbollah Amal alliance over the cities. And so what I found is essentially that, quite simply, municipal governments need strong party support to function well. this was my core finding. It wasn't exactly an optimistic finding, given what we know about these parties and the sort of predatory control that they've exercised over Lebanese politics. But this was sort of my finding, and this is what people would tell me very openly. Municipal elites, people who dealt with the municipality, people who in many cases were, to my mind, quite earnestly trying to do right by their constituents. They found themselves really sort of in this in this situation where they had to choose between acquiescing to the various demands of these parties and acquiescing to being sort of under their thumb, or essentially rendering their own city ungovernable.
Yes, yes. And so from looking at that, did you find not necessarily one place was necessarily better governed than another area, but did you find the sort of political prominence of certain parties meant certain areas did slightly better in some indicators than in other areas governed by other political parties who may be not as prominent anymore?
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny to think back at the comparison that I was making, because two of the strongest urban protest centers in the 2019 protests were Tripoli and Saida, both of these places, right? But what I found is that the dominant Sunni Muslim ethnic party in Lebanon at the time, the Future Movement, exercised comparatively very little control over Tripoli compared to Saida, where it had largely controlled the municipality almost continuously since the civil war. And what I found is that that had very strong implications for what governance looked like in those two cities. So in Saida, the municipality functioned fairly well. This is not to say that there were not governance issues and corruption. In fact, in many cases, the municipality functioning well actually facilitated corruption, right? These two things tended to go together. And in Tripoli, the municipality virtually ceased functioning a few years into its tenure, specifically because it was hamstrung by the central state. Whenever it had requests or it wanted to get something done, it was an opposition municipality. It was not controlled by a party with power within the central government. And so it was really handicapped from governing. So of course it was kind of, at the end of the day, a choice between like bad and worse. But I do think in terms of how governance was perceived and how it affected everyday citizens, it did and does still matter.
I'm sort of also wondering about this in terms of security and policing, because one of the things that sort of struck me and other common people watching Lebanon in October 2019 and up until about, I'd say, December, January, is there was obviously suppression going on. You saw tear gas being fired, but it was also the relative lack of overall violence when you think about other countries at even borders. Their first death, I think, took place 2 or 3 months after the protests began, which, is very, very tragic and very horrific that this would happen. But when you're thinking about countries nearby where first death happens on the first protest, it's what accounts for the state's reaction to these protests?
This is a really good question, and one that I still think is kind of open empirically. Comparing the Lebanon and Iraq protests in 2019, not to discount the lives that were lost in Lebanon and the other people who were injured or otherwise repressed during the protests, but the degree of violence in these two cases was just so different, orders of magnitude different. One could imagine that there are very different legacies of state-imposed violence in places like Lebanon versus Iraq, right? Lebanon has never been an authoritarian country. I think that is obviously a broad strokes feature that's having an impact on the state's relative reluctance, not absolute reluctance, to use violence. And to be fair, much of the violence that was exercised in the protests in 2019 in Lebanon was actually exercised by non-state groups, specifically by Hezbollah and Amal. And so that's another sort of feature that's not unique to Lebanon, but the sort of use of, I suppose in this case, we might call them parastatal actors to suppress the protests without it being the formal security forces going out and doing it.
But of course, because when we think about security forces, in the case of the militias and the groups that control it, Hezbollah could commit violence and no one would stop them because they are a de facto security force in Lebanon.
Yes, and I think it's not only important to note the use of force that Hezbollah and Amal engaged in during these protests, breaking down protest sites, sending thugs to beat up protesters, but also just the potential threat of violence, I think, does matter and was acknowledged by protesters. And I think getting back to the question of what did the protests look like outside of Beirut, this was something that I heard in particular from people in places like Baalbek, where protests started later. People were much more reluctant to protest. And when they did, they often faced a much more severe looming threat of violence because of the degree of party control, specifically by these parties that have demonstrated willingness to use force.
So did, for example, Hezbollah coordinate with other parties for crackdowns elsewhere, or was it just in our municipality, we're going to do this? We're not bothered by what happens in, say, Tripoli or elsewhere?
To a certain extent, I couldn't speak, I think, to the specifics at the level that you're talking about, but my sense is that a party like Hezbollah that has very little popularity or representation comparatively within a place like Tripoli and does not have that sort of same co-sectarian affiliation would largely stay out of the protest movement there. And I think per what we know from a scholarly perspective on in-group policing in ethnic communities, that each of these sort of governing ethno-sectarian parties in Lebanon are particularly interested in policing the behavior and the loyalty of their own communities. And so I think that's where they chose to concentrate their resources, and also to a certain extent, of course, within the capital, which was the sort of focal point of the protests.
So we've spoken a lot about the protests, and obviously many things have happened since then. You had the 2020 Beirut port explosion, you've had financial meltdown since then. So I'm wondering now, here in 2022, where are we today with this movement of protesters? And
yeah, as you say, it's apart from being a really massive human tragedy, it's also kind of a nightmare from a scholarly perspective to untangle cause and effect here, because so much has happened, right? Not only the protests, but also this cataclysmic economic crisis, COVID, the Beirut port explosion, et cetera. And we already discussed that protester expectations or demands ranged really widely, and they were not uniform. I would almost separate them into maybe procedural versus substantive demands. So procedural demands, I'm thinking about things like the resignation of the government, which did come shortly after the protests began, with the resignation of Saad Hariri, early elections, electoral reform, that sort of thing. And then you had substantive demands, the regulation of the banking sector, capital controls, social protection, negotiation of the terms of a deal with the International Monetary Fund. And I would say several of those procedural demands have been over time met, including the renewal of elections. These substantive demands, not so much. But in terms of elections, obviously the national elections that occurred in May of this year, I do think demonstrated that these governing parties' sort of ironclad monopoly on power is likely over. I don't want to overstate or make bold predictive claims, but typically in these sorts of systems where you see a cartel of parties that monopolize power, typically when you start to see it erode, it's the beginning of the end, right? And I think what these latest elections did was demonstrate that it was possible to undermine the total electoral dominance of the people who have governed since the end of the Civil War. But what's the ultimate impact of this new representation? In a government as divided as Lebanon's today, not much legislatively. So the deadlock over government formation seems like it will continue, potentially for a very long time. But I guess on a more optimistic note, from an electoral perspective and the perspective of electoral representation, including looking forward to municipal elections, local elections that are scheduled to happen next year, I think these protests and their aftermath did fundamentally legitimize and shape an entirely different discourse around politics that is decentered from the politics of ethno-sectarian identity or sort of establishment parties. There is now, I think, a really clear regime versus opposition dynamic that has always been there. I don't want to suggest that it hasn't been present, but that has been legitimized and recognized in public discourse and used as the basis of doing politics by people who are now demonstrably receiving quite a bit of mass support. And that I don't think has ever happened in the country's history. And so where that leads, particularly given the sort of contours of the political order today, I'm not sure, but I do think it's evidence of a new type of politics emerging.
So I have two more questions because as you're talking, I keep coming up with more questions.
Okay.
It's the sound of a good guest. So the next question I want to sort of ask is, so you did all this sort of research, you went on the ground and you spoke to people in these different municipalities. From what you could see, how do you see sort of society changing just based on the people you've spoken to? How have they changed in the last few years?
Yeah, it was really interesting because I did a lot of interviews with people involved in municipal affairs right before these protests happened, I would say in the 2 years prior. And then I went back to Lebanon a few times for shorter trips, and I talked with some of those same people after these protests had occurred. And many of these people, they really ranged in terms of their identities. Some of them were longtime party loyalists who were also at the same time quite interested in the development and, infrastructure and welfare of their cities. Other people were very reformist minded. They had, broken with the traditional parties or they had never been a part of them. And what I saw, again, speaking to what I was saying earlier, was the real acknowledgement by all of these people of the idea of a cohesive multi-party regime that had unfortunately captured Lebanese politics and that in some way was not reformable, that actually needed to be ousted or removed from politics altogether. This idea of all of them is all of them, of course, was far more recognized, including by people who I wouldn't have necessarily expected to recognize it as a valid idea. On the other hand, I did see some similar ideas related to lopsided blame or partisan affiliation or loyalty emerge, right? So some of the people that I talked to, for example, would say, what's going on in Lebanon is horrible. We need reform. We need change. But there are some people who are more to blame than others, right? And there are some guys, specifically the guys that I used to support, who are not as to blame, or they are simply beholden to other people within the system. So there's a sort of hierarchy of blame developing. And I do think, again, it speaks to that idea that it's really hard to sort of precisely pinpoint blame in a system where power is as diffusely and complexly distributed as a place like Lebanon.
So my last question, I want to sort of turn away from what we've discussed to think more broadly. So we want to talk a bit about your own sort of personal journey into why you studied Lebanon, but also how would, say, a young, person somewhere in the world who's interested in maybe studying Lebanon, like, how do they sort of get their bearings with studying Lebanese politics? How do they actually do it?
Oh my gosh, I'm still learning. Ask me in maybe like a decade or something. I'm not Lebanese. I came into the politics of the country relatively blind and depended a lot on the kindness of strangers who knew far more than me. And the only thing that I came into the context with was a vague sense of what had been written before, and the types of things that had really been focused on. And specifically, kind of circling back to the first part of our conversation, the politics of ethno-sectarian identity, of sect, of confessionalism, et cetera. And without discounting the importance of those features, I was interested in looking at the other types of politics that were happening in a place like Lebanon. So I guess my broad piece of advice, or what I've done that I've found fruitful, is to look where other people aren't looking. And part of that was also doing reading about places outside of Lebanon and kind of trying to understand how people characterized politics in other parts of the global South. I looked a lot at literature on local governance in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America. I found that really, really helpful. And I also relied a lot, not just on the kindness of strangers, but also the intellectual production that had already gone on surrounding the topic of local governance, of center-periphery relations in Lebanon, because it was certainly there. And other scholars had looked at this and pointed out that it might be a provocative point of study. And so yeah, that's really who I would credit more than anything I did.
Christiana Parreira, thank you very much for talking to us in Memo Conversation.
Thank you.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Tune in next time for more Memo Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.